It wasn't any one person's idea. There was no grand master plan.
The national parks are all so different.
In some ways, they were visionary, beginning a movement that spread around the world.
National parks are amazing places for research and, most importantly, for exploration.
In other ways, they were flashpoints in the battle between public land and private rights. In every way, they reflected the country, the good, the bad, and the bizarre.
It was a really bad idea.
Now, the National Park Service is 100 years old and counting. The last century is full of stories, and the next century is full of possibility. Native Americans had many names for it. Land of the burning ground, place of hot water, and many smoke. Centuries later, white explorers wrote of its wonders, but were often dismissed as liars. They called it Yellowstone. In 1870, a group including Montana official Nathaniel P. Langford set off to find it. Langford wrote, "We came suddenly upon a basin of boiling sulfur springs, throwing water and fearful volumes of vapor higher than our heads. Water smoked, mud bubbled, colors bled. Congress heard about the hot-spewing geysers and figured the place was too rugged to ever be farmed or homesteaded. Economically, it appeared worthless. So with little debate, they passed a bill to protect it. They had just created the world's first national park, and it was a whopper. Over 2 million acres splayed across 3 territories that weren't even states yet. Congress asked Nathaniel P. Langford to be Yellowstone's first superintendent for no pay. He accepted.
The earliest visitors to Yellowstone who came to see these natural wonders with their own eyes were a very hardy bunch.
Tourists roamed on their own, hoping they wouldn't fall into a cauldron and boil to death. Several did. Others came less for the scenery and more for the spoils. Outlaws robbed visiting coaches. Vandals carved their names on geyser formations. Hunters slaughtered buffalo by the score, often just for sport. Now, there are resurgent herds, protective boardwalks, and well-rehearsed crowd control. Nearly 3 million people come to Yellowstone every year. The last century has been filled with trial and error of how to run a national park like Yellowstone. But one thing really hasn't changed. You still have to see it to believe it. Not all the early parks were Western wonders. Cutting through Washington, D.C. is a natural waterway called Rock Creek. During the Civil War, Union soldiers felled many of the surrounding trees and laid them out as speed bumps for invading Confederate troops. After the war, civic leaders pushed to preserve this natural wedge of green space. It was made a park in 1890. Washington residents have enjoyed it ever since. Rock Creek National Park is right in the middle of an urban area that tops 6 million people.
People use it in so many different ways. It's a park that connects neighborhoods, makes DC what it is.
But there are still places where the city seems to disappear.
When you look around, you don't see too much of the DC that most people know. This is a beautiful piece of woods.
Bill McShay wanted to know what lives in national parks, including one surrounded by a city.
For about 3 years, we set cameras in different national parks, and one of them was Rock Creek Park, to see what's here, when is it active, how does it relate to the trail use that people are using.
The animal census program is called eMammal, and the backbone of the project is the camera trap.
They have a heat motion sensor, so it has to be a hot body and it has to be moving in front of the camera, which will zoom in on whatever is moving and take a picture of it.
Camera traps have been deployed all over the world.
China, Malaysia, Burma, to African sites, to North American sites. And you catch the animal unawares.
Inside Rock Creek Park, they revealed the city's wild side.
It wouldn't surprise people to hear we got a lot of white-tailed deer pictures. What was surprising to me are wild turkeys. I've never seen or heard anyone report a wild turkey for this park, but we had quite a number of wild turkey images in there during the day. Are there coyotes? Yes, the coyotes are here. We got as many coyote images here as we got in any of the other parks we surveyed, even the most rural parks. At times, you think this is primarily a people park, but it's really an animal park, too.
It is a biosphere, a historic site, and a city park, all within a slice of woods no wider than a mile. Rock Creek Park is an ongoing experiment in the urban wild.
This is as good a piece of woods as you'll find anywhere, and we're in the middle of a city.
The earliest national parks preserved nature. Now they preserve much more. Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, was the site of the deadliest battle in the Civil War. About 50,000 soldiers were killed or wounded in just 3 days.
I don't know if we really can truly imagine what it must have been like to have a battle or a war unfolding literally in your backyard.
Every house and building became a hospital. Every garden and field became a graveyard. After the battle, residents and veterans from both sides became concerned about the poor condition of scattered, shallow graves. They advocated for a permanent cemetery. Abraham Lincoln dedicated that graveyard with the Gettysburg Address. By 1895, the government declared it a national military park, overseen by the War Department. There was not yet a National Park Service. Today, the land is preserved not just for ceremony and reflection, but protection. There are still stories to unearth from the Civil War's hallowed battlegrounds. This skull fragment was found more than a century after guns fell silent on the battlefields of Antietam.
It was found by some individuals that were using metal detectors, and they picked up this burial.
It reveals one moment among millions that defined the Civil War.
When I'm dealing with human remains from military parks, and they are men that died on that battlefield, that is the reality of the war. I mean, that type of fighting is unbelievable fighting.
Doug Owsley and Kari Brulhide can unravel the mystery of unknown remains.
Any bone that comes into our lab, we think of as an individual. We know that each bone has a story to tell. It's a human life.
The life of this soldier remains a mystery, but his death is quite clear.
This piece of bone is from the Antietam battlefield. It is a piece of the cranium that is from the back of the head. It's called the occipital bone, and it covers almost the entire back portion. Now, what's special with this bone is that it has a defect right here that is indicative of a gunshot wound exit. And I can tell that because the margins on the outside surface of the bone are beveled. And it's beveled because the force of the traveling projectile will fracture the bone outward. So when this individual was shot, the bullet was traveling from the front of the person and exited out the back of the head.
These are soft lead, low-velocity bullets, and as they hit, they'll often deform, they'll tumble, and they'll leave little particles. And so in the X-ray, you can see a good bullet fragment that's still embedded in the bone.
The rest of the soldiers' bones were reburied with full military honors. The Smithsonian keeps this fragment for preservation and education.
Telling that story makes the event, the history, so much more, not just tangible, but so much more personal.
Even today, more than a century later, human remains are still being found on Civil War battlefields.
And if they weren't protected, those things might be destroyed.
They serve as a reminder to the sacrifice of our ancestors to build this nation, the nation that it is today.
After the Civil War, one soldier who lost his arm in battle led one of the greatest river adventures in American history. In May of 1869, a team set off to navigate the surging Colorado River through unknown territory, including a canyon that was mostly just a rumor. Leading the expedition was John Wesley Powell, a one-armed Civil War veteran and geology professor. He left in a company of 10 men in 4 wooden boats. Along the way, one boat was wrecked. 4 men quit out of fear. 3 of them hiked away and were never seen again. But 6 men, including Powell, made it through, the first known white men to traverse the Grand Canyon.
But Grand Canyon was the home place of American Indians. This is where people lived for centuries upon centuries, and where their kin are buried in their sacred places.
Native Americans still live inside the Grand Canyon amid ancestral petroglyphs that predate Powell's excursion by 6,000 years. The 20th century saw great changes for the canyon. Tourism exploded. Some came for the view from the rim. Others came for the trek to the bottom. Now, some want to build another tourist development on the south rim and a tramway to the canyon floor. It has been explored, exploited, and exalted as one of the great wonders of the world. But it's not the only place to attract adventure. In 1870, a 15-year-old boy from Kansas ate his lunch while reading the newspaper it was wrapped in. He was captivated by a story of a mysterious lake in Oregon, and he vowed to go there someday. 15 years later, he journeyed west by rail, then stagecoach. He went the last 20 miles on foot. Finally, William Steele arrived at Crater Lake. Its waters are nothing more than rain and snowmelt. No rivers lead in or out of it. It is one of the clearest lakes in the world and one of the deepest at almost 2,000 feet. The allure of Crater Lake never let William Steele go. He worked for 17 years to persuade his government to preserve it. By 1902, it was a national park. During the gold rush in 1851, a band of armed men came through Yosemite Valley to chase away Indians. They may have been ready for a fight, but not ready for the sight. The scenery of Yosemite brought one of those horsemen to tears. The earliest white visitors wandered and photographed and flashed occasional moments of joy.
Just imagine, coming into the park and seeing Half Dome or El Capitan, these rock formations that are like nothing you could ever imagine.
The landscape has long evoked wonder and spurred scientific theories. For decades, scientists thought an earthquake had created the steep valleys of Yosemite in a violent spasm. John Muir was the first to propose they were carved more slowly by glaciers. His theory proved correct. In 1903, he camped for 3 nights with President Teddy Roosevelt and bent his ear about better preserving Yosemite. Roosevelt agreed, taking a patchwork of state and federal lands and proposing one cohesive national park. But there was still not yet a National Park Service. So who was protecting these parks?
You know, I think it was kind of a free-for-all. It was a very dangerous place and you know, very much, you know, sort of the Wild West.
Early parks were hard to police. Park boundaries were invisible if not ignored. The idea of preservation didn't always trickle down to individual citizens. So the government sent the cavalry, United States Army units on horseback, to protect western parks from looters, poachers, and scammers. Upon arriving at Yosemite, one soldier wrote, "It is the cavalryman's paradise, food and drink for his horse everywhere." Among those sent west were the military's first African-American units, the Buffalo Soldiers.
There was discomfort around the idea of African Americans policing whites.
The military sent them out to western parks, where there were fewer people to police.
The contingent that went to Sequoia was headed up by Captain Charles Young.
Captain Young, only the 3rd African-American to graduate from West Point, did not seem to mind the assignment. He wrote, "A journey through this park will convince even the least thoughtful man of the needfulness of preserving these mountains just as they are." Buffalo Soldiers built the first trail to the top of Mount Whitney and evicted timber thieves, despite being issued the worst horses and oldest equipment. In a promotion that would be hard to imagine back east, Charles Young was put in charge of Sequoia National Park as acting superintendent. By 1906, there were just 6 national parks. Most were simply big, gorgeous spaces. But there was a new movement to save smaller historic places. They were called national monuments, and they changed the course of American conservation.
That was really the first formal attempt to preserve what they might have called at the time works of man.
At ancient Native American sites like Chaco Canyon in New Mexico and Mesa Verde in Colorado, poachers, called pot hunters, were stealing cultural treasures to sell to the highest bidder. Smithsonian's Jesse Walter Fuchs was trying to catalog the antiquities as they were disappearing. He wrote, "If this destruction goes on, these unique dwellings will be practically destroyed." In 1906, Congress passed a bill called the Antiquities Act.
It allowed the president to set aside national monuments by executive order without the approval of Congress.
One presidential signature could now provide instant protection for any, quote, historic or scientific interest. Armed with the law's vague language, President Teddy Roosevelt jumped right to it. He quickly protected Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde. Then he added Devil's Tower in Wyoming, the Grand Canyon in Arizona, and Mount Olympus in Washington, among others. Roosevelt created 18 national monuments in less than 3 years. Many would later become national parks. One of his signatures protected a weird, rugged place that looks like ruins on another planet. National parks don't just preserve geography, they invite discovery. In 1853, an expedition came through what looked like a desert graveyard. One wrote in his journal, "Past today immense masses of petrified wood. whole trees with very long bases, lying on the ground in a complete state of petrification. When these trees were alive, Arizona's petrified forest looked a lot different. To see it as it was, you have to know where to dig.
It looks like Badlands, but for us, it's good lands. It's a place where we can go hunting and actually find things.
Kay Berensmeyer is a paleobiologist, which includes the art of fossil hunting. Her team brought blocks of ancient stone from the petrified forest to the Smithsonian's Museum of Natural History.
And then in a fossil lab, under a microscope, the volunteers excavate very, very slowly around these tiny pieces. And they find all kinds of things that way that we could never find if we were just trying to do this in the field.
In a series of blocks that add up to just 1 square meter, they uncovered more than 900 fossils, each belonging to an animal that lived in a vastly different landscape.
200 million years ago or more, it looked like a swamp and a forest. There were various kinds of strange plants. There were strange animals in the waterways.
So national parks don't just protect space, but time.
It's just an incredible opportunity to see this long view. It's deep time. We can see the trajectory of this planet and of life on this planet, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful story.
By 1916, you did have all these different national parks that had been established in different places and for different reasons, and they were being managed in different ways.
Finally, 44 years after the government created the first national park, it created the National Park Service. Now, there was a chance for a coherent strategy of how to protect the parks and connect them to the public. That strategy is still evolving.
Most visitors go to parks and are not aware at all of the active science that's going on.
There's sort of been this gap, and it's really neat to see sort of those light bulb moments when the park visitors get excited about seeing their public lands as like a laboratory.
Louise Allen and her husband Nikolai Hristov are biologists who spend a lot of time in the dark expanses of New Mexico's Carlsbad Caverns.
Carlsbad is massive. It's enormous. Carlsbad doesn't disappoint.
They have developed a way to see the unseen, though at first the process seems very low-tech.
They look like Sputniks, little foam spheres with little barbecue skewers stuck into them.
And what we're going to do is put them at different sections of the cave. What do they think of the... And then when we do the scanning, the scanner will pick up the balls. Every time it touches, it reflects the light.
I'm scanner 2.
With laser scanners and reference spheres, they light up the dark. Many of the caverns have yet to be explored, and fewer still have been mapped in 3D.
We simply have never illuminated these spaces in the way that the laser can do it.
And you can look at the volume of that space. You can do cross sections. You can do pretty much any measures that you want.
It's accurate to millimeters.
The Carlsbad Caverns are a world-famous home for bats. For years, Nick and Louise have studied them and seen a reversal of their reputation.
They turned from these creepy, scary, blood-sucking creatures into these really mystic and attractive and endlessly interesting creatures.
Now that people are more curious about bats, they're more curious about bat science.
Night after night, I would set up these computers with big, colorful screens and live thermal images of the bats.
Every night, we'd have a good line of people asking us what's going on.
Nick and Louise saw an opportunity to make new connections between the park and the public.
There was really a need to bring the park rangers up to date on the current science.
So they started a program called iSwoop, which stands for Interpreters and Scientists Working on Our Parks. Rangers get closer to the cutting-edge research and make it part of the visitor experience. Instead of outdated talking points, rangers can bring up the open-ended questions of science and progress. Less lecture, more discussion. It's a far cry from the scripted ranger talks of yesteryear.
You can walk into a national park and you're in the middle of somebody's experiment. There's active science going on in almost every park, and it's pretty exciting.
The National Park Service has set up long-range plans for the preservation and enjoyment of the parks. And the coming of the Conservation Corps put these plans into action.
In the 1930s, the Great Depression put millions out of work. In response, the government employed thousands of men in the Civilian Conservation Corps. They worked on infrastructure projects all across the country, including national parks.
There was a lot of work that needed to be done and could be done on public lands.
They were paid around $30 a month, but the government required them to send most of it back home to keep local economies afloat.
Many of the roads and trails and campgrounds and other facilities that people are using in national parks today were built by the CCC. That truly transformed the national park experience.
In Virginia's Shenandoah, they helped give Skyline Drive better views and cut sections of the Appalachian Trail. They crisscrossed the desolate landscape of Death Valley to run telephone lines, build campgrounds, and make trails. The men of the CCC endured Army-like conditions. Government-issued uniforms, crowded camp living, and bad grub. But the trade-off was the pride of a hard day's work and having their eyes open to the wonders of their own country. Many had never been away from home or spent any time in the wilderness. The experience put many Americans in touch with their national parks for the very first time. The CCC was not the only stamp that Franklin Roosevelt left on the Park Service.
What FDR did was bring together parks that were being managed by other federal agencies into the national park system.
The Park Service was now in charge of the Statue of Liberty, the National Mall in Washington, D.C., Abraham Lincoln's birthplace in Kentucky, and Mount Rushmore in South Dakota, among many others. Preservation was beginning to pivot from wild and natural to man-made and historic. In 1938, these islands were set aside not just for their beauty, but their remarkable story of human ingenuity. Nestled off the coast of California, Channel Islands National Park is one of the most isolated sites in the park system. They seem remote, but they turn out to be a busy intersection of human history and natural evolution.
There's really no place I can think of on Earth that's quite like them. We often call them a North American Galapagos. They're that special.
Surrounding seas act as a barrier to give the islands a unique story. Like the Galapagos, the Channel Islands are a grand experiment in local evolution. Animals like the island fox and the scrub jay are only found here. Despite low foot traffic by modern visitors, these islands have a long human history. Surprisingly, longer than any other coast on the continent.
Native Americans, the Chumash and the Tongva people who lived on the Channel Islands, they were very much coastally focused and maritime focused people.
They were also a pioneering people. Excavations reveal a startling theory. They were the first seafaring culture in the Americas, dating back 13,000 years. Shell beads, abalone, small stone spears and hooks. These are just some of the artifacts used by the early people of the Channel Islands. From deep within the Smithsonian archives, Torben Rick continues to piece together this cultural puzzle. One revealing artifact is a miniature canoe.
We interpret these as being either toys or what we call heuristic or learning devices, you know, so you can imagine these teaching people about their culture, about who they are, about important parts of their life. And this prepares them then to be making their own boats maybe, or going out in those boats for fishing or trade or exchange.
These artifacts signify a community that had long-distance transportation, a bartering system, even art. Now, the national parks provide a place to discover these and other ancient and diverse cultures. But the Park Service hasn't always been so culturally sensitive. For decades, they shared America's struggle with stereotypes.
African Americans in particular, and I think other minorities as well, were presented in many instances in less than a human way.
And it does make you cringe when you think about it today.
Interpreting the history of different peoples is central to the modern mission of the Park Service. America is one of the busiest cultural intersections on the planet. Many sites reveal the surprisingly global history of the country. Florida was part of the Spanish Empire when construction began on Castillo de San Marcos in 1672. It's the oldest masonry fort in the continental U.S. As late as the 19th century, parts of Alaska were colonies of Russia. This house in Sitka once housed the bishop assigned to spread the Russian Orthodox faith among Alaska natives. In northeastern Minnesota, this quiet lakeside fort was once a bustling 18th century commercial hub for Europeans, French Canadians, and local Ojibwe. Beaver pelts from the Pacific Northwest made it all the way back to Moscow. But there are also historic sites that commemorate difficult chapters of American history.
Parks have been established that are reflecting some of our more shameful moments in our history. Japanese internment, for example, or slavery.
The Park Service has the responsibility to research, preserve, and interpret history where history occurred.
And it is important that we, as the National Park Service, reflect the full range of human experiences.
National parks have distinguishing features. They're making an important contribution to the health and happiness of millions now living, and still more millions of the future.
After World War II, Americans could collectively exhale. With good jobs, spare time, and new cars, they hit the road.
So with the advent of the interstate system, visitors to the national park increased substantially.
In fact, visitor numbers doubled in just 5 years. 98% of them arrived by car. Even the improvements made by the CCC were not enough to support the avalanche of new visitors.
Where there wasn't a road, people were making a road.
The people, said one park official, are wearing out the scenery. And so began a mission to make upgrades in time for the Park Service's 50th anniversary in 1966. It was called Mission 66.
It was an effort to really improve the visitor experience in parks.
One idea to control crowds was to centralize their arrival and educate them on what they should and shouldn't do. The Visitor Center was born. By the time the Park Service turned 50, the parks had undergone quite a facelift. National parks were now at the top of many families' summer vacation plans. Armed with station wagons and movie cameras, Americans gobbled it up.
I was definitely that kid. That's what we did as a family, was visit national parks. These were such special places, and those memories really stick with me today.
Managing people is one thing. Managing wildlife is another. For decades, the Park Service allowed people to approach and feed bears.
They used to put out bait, in Yellowstone and places to attract the bears because that's what people wanted to see.
They allowed garbage dumps to become bear bait, even setting up bleachers for people to watch. It brought in the crowds, but ruined the bears. They became dumpster divers and camp invaders. In Yellowstone alone, bears injured almost 50 people a year. In 1970, the parks reversed course, trying to return bears to their natural habits. They prohibited feeding, cleaned up the dumps, and installed bear-proof garbage cans. In time, encounters between people and bears plummeted. Policy changes also spelled the end of a questionable custom that used to dazzle crowds in Yosemite Valley. On summer nights, there was a 100-year-old tradition to build a bonfire at the top of Glacier Point. Then at 9 p.m. sharp, it was pushed over the edge, creating a spectacular firefall that plunged over a half-mile to the valley floor.
It must have been a visually stunning thing to watch, but also a really bad idea.
In 1968, this spectacle didn't fit the Park Service's evolving mindset. Director George Hartzog finally put a stop to it. He said it was about as appropriate for the silent tranquility and beauty of that great valley as horns on a rabbit. But 2 years later, Hartzog's vision of silent tranquility in Yosemite would go up in smoke. The environmental movement of the 1960s seemed to vindicate the preservation ideal that began a century earlier. More people were visiting parks than ever before. But in one case, they wouldn't leave. In the summer of 1970, one meadow in Yosemite became a hub for the counterculture. Getting back to nature was now in vogue. But they were not just passing through. They stayed, camped without permits, and partied. The meadow did not look so natural anymore. Rangers debated the situation with the students.
You look out here, it's become a lawn.
National parks are not set aside to be big rustic fun farms. This is an ecological stretcher case.
The Park Service tried to find the line between use and abuse, between enjoyment by the public and enforcement of the rules.
Why would you want a confrontation in the meadow?
On July 4th, park officials announced they were going to clear the meadow.
You can hear the reaction of the crowd. The meadow is to be cleared at 7 o'clock because of excessive quantities of litter, noise, etc.
Like many other scenes from the 1960s, it soon got ugly.
Get this action, man. They're wrecking people. The horse ran over someone, knocked down. There are people who are hurt. A lot of people are hurt. There are clubs and sticks. It's now a wholesale riot. The mace is burning in my eyes, burning in everybody's eyes.
The Park Service learned a lesson that day and applied it to the future.
The stuff that went on in the meadows in Yosemite was what led to the development of the Park Service law enforcement ranger.
Later in the 1970s, the battle between public lands and private rights moved north. Alaska became ground zero. Alaska is on a scale all its own. Some say it also has a mindset of its own. In 1978, Jimmy Carter used the Antiquities Act to try to create 17 new national monuments in Alaska.
I don't think it went over very well. I think there was great concern about what this meant.
Alaskans, who have always been fiercely independent, challenged the move. Many considered it federal overreach, a threat to their way of life. The legal dust settled by 1980. Carter's move stood with a unique compromise on how the lands could be used.
It did make provision for hunting and subsistence and fishing that would not be allowable in the lower 48.
The legislation turned more than 73,000 square miles into public land, virtually doubling the size of Park Service properties. It was the single largest stroke of conservation in world history. Mount McKinley National Park officially reverted back to its native Alaskan name, Denali, meaning the Great One, and the Park Service land around it tripled. But size doesn't matter as much for this national park. Location does.
When I say that I'm working in the national park, and they're like, "Where? Like, how do you get there?" I'm like, "I take the 2 train." I work in Brooklyn. There's a national park right here.
Gateway is a patchwork of green spaces and shorelines in greater New York City, a place not often associated with peace and quiet.
Gateway is a bit off the grid for most New Yorkers. We tend to live and walk on solid ground, on concrete, on sidewalks. We follow sort of grid-like patterns most days of our lives. And Gateway really has that kind of outback feel.
Everything is still. You just feel the breeze. You see the trees, you see like the butterflies and birds flying around, but there aren't like cars honking and the subway screeching. So for me, it's like a place where you can breathe.
Neil is one of the many young interns at Gateway.
We have people from like India and Russia, and myself from Guyana, Ecuador, all over the world.
The mission was really to bring the national park experience closer for people who couldn't necessarily travel. I think for some people, especially newcomers to this country, the idea of going and sleeping out under the trees is stretching the comfort zone a little bit.
The Park Service is trying to serve a broader cross-section of Americans than ever before.
Gateway is meant to be an introduction, an entree into the national park experience.
Small parks close to big cities may be a new focus of the Park Service. But there's still room in their portfolio for big landscapes. Right outside the neon glow of Las Vegas lies a brand new park. Tule Springs Fossil Beds National Monument was created by President Obama in 2014.
So we're at the edge of a city that has 2.5 million people. Just 30 minutes from the craziness of Las Vegas is a place that you can almost feel like you're a long ways away from Las Vegas.
John Burpee is the superintendent. For now, he's the only employee. He oversees more than 35 square miles. Most of it is classic desert. But tucked into this landscape are washes that are like time tunnels back to the last 2 ice ages.
These represent discrete moments in Earth's past. And so being able to interpret these, this is looking at the history of one spot through time.
Locals can still hike in Tule Springs, but more destructive activity is banned. That's because right where kids used to ride dirt bikes are fossils that could end up in their textbooks.
The rock stars out here, as far as the fossils go, are the Columbian mammoths. Usually every single time we're out here, we find some bits and pieces of these animals, which would have stood 18 foot tall at the shoulder at the most. The record tusk is about 18 feet long.
Tule Springs is writing new chapters of Nevada's surprising past, which was more wild and more wet.
During the last ice age, we would have actually been sitting underwater right now. So this would have been one of these active springs. the whole story of Tule Springs unfolds.
The story of Tule Springs will continue to unfold.
We don't have a visitor center yet. We don't have marked trails. All of that will come in the near future. But what you have is a national park that's just been born.
We're in the perpetuity business in the National Park Service. That's what we do. Parks like Tule Springs are an opportunity for us to make sure that we get it right.
100 years of lessons learned, 400 sites and growing. The Park Service has a busy century ahead. What will Tule Springs become? What will the national parks become? What stories will they tell?
They're reserves for the imagination. They're places where everyone can feel that they are explorers.
National parks are places to teach us how we respect each other.
The national parks are us. You, me, they're us.